Thank you so much, Eva. It's such a pleasure and an honor for me to be here. Eva was one of my students at UCI, one of the most brilliant of them, and I would say the same of Goja and Christine and Yadira, Mariam, and so many other. So thank you for coming. Adam also from EGS, my colleagues, some of my colleagues from UCI, and all of you. So, of course, I'm a bit nervous. I didn't really know what to say, so I decided to retrace a little bit my trajectory, hoping to show how this trajectory is not only philosophical, but can also be of some interest for artists. So my talk proposes, it's not very long, don't worry, it's about half an hour, and then I hope we can have a discussion, a less formal discussion. So opening, transgressing, shaping. This talk proposes a way of thinking that begins with reading, but not reading in the narrow academic sense. I want to explore how three specific conceptual actions, opening, transgressing, and shaping, can guide not only our interpretation of texts, but also our processes of creating, performing, and understanding artistic work. These actions, these three movements, draw from philosophical and theoretical traditions, yet they're not exclusive to philosophers. Rather, they reflect modes of engagement with meaning, material, and form that artists, dancers, performers, and other creative practitioners already intuitively or even explicitly use. Reading in this sense is not about text alone. It's about the interpretation of movement, gesture, material, space, and the act of making sense of what is seen and felt. So we read not just books, but also bodies, surfaces, silences, proximities. We read time, rhythm, volume, intensity. That's why reading is the ground of hermeneutics, and every interpretation is a creation. What I'll describe here is rooted, as I said, in my own trajectory as a philosopher and a reader, but I hope, once again, that it will resonate with your own experiences of responding to forms and breaking them open. So I'd like to share three theories of reading. Each of them comes from a major philosophical corpus. So opening, transgressing, shaping are these three theories, or gestures, more exactly. First, Derrida's deconstruction, opening, Foucault's critique, transgressing, and what I have proposed as a plastic theory of reading for shaping. Each suggests a different way of deciphering, and by extension of acting, intervening, or composing, whether the material is a text, a body, an image, a history, or a practice. So these three theories of reading drawn from philosophy are not theories to apply, but to think with, and each opens what I would call a method. So they are, first, the theory of the trace. This is opening for Derrida. Second, the theory of the limit. This is transgressing, Foucault. And then the theory of form. This is for shaping and reshaping, plasticity. So I start with the first one, Derrida and the theory of the trace. The first gesture, opening, reading as an opening, first appears in Derrida's book of grammatology from 1967. Reading, Derrida says, is an opening. He writes that to read is to clear a path through a jungle, the forest of the text, opening up a road map in it. He uses the expression in Latin via fracta, the broken path. What he means by that is that reading is not a passive act of following, but an active cutting gesture. We might say that it is a performative incision. To read is to cut, to open a space that was not already visible. Most readings simply follow what they read. They paraphrase it. Sometimes their comments are highly pertinent and enlightening, but they remain historical, not theoretical. To open a reading, by contrast, is to ensure that the reading itself becomes creative. In other terms, that it becomes a writing. Reading must not be a commentary, but a new proposal. It has to produce, Derrida says, I quote, a signifying structure. So I'm reading the passage from Of Grammatology in which Derrida explains what it is about. To produce this signifying structure, he writes, obviously cannot consist of reproducing by the effaced and respectful doubling of commentary the conscious, voluntary, intentional relationship that the writer institutes in his exchanges with the history to which he belongs, thanks to the element of language. So sorry for the he. It was written in 1967, so Derrida was still using the he. This moment of doubling commentary should no doubt have its place in a critical reading. To recognize and respect all its classical exigencies is not easy and requires all the instruments of traditional criticism. Without this recognition and this respect, critical production would risk developing in any direction at all and authorize itself to say almost anything. But this indispensable guardrail has always only protected, it has never opened a reading. So okay for a commentary if it protects the text, but it won't open it. It won't produce precisely this signifying structure that cuts through the text. So what is a signifying structure? How do you cut through a text? He explains, I quote again, the reading must always aim at a certain relationship, unperceived by the writer, between what he comments and what he does not comment of the patterns of the language that he uses. The relationship is not a certain quantitative distribution of shadow and light, of weakness and of force, but a signifying structure that critical reading should produce. So it's about what the author does not command from the patterns of the language that they use. Artists might hear this as a call to attend to the overlooked materials of their practice, the scrap, the residue, the trace, and ask, what forgotten element structures the whole? Derrida says that to open the reading is to know how to look in what he calls the neglected corners of the text's architecture, and he even uses the word architecture. To read the trace is perhaps to find what has been rendered invisible by habit or hierarchy and to perform its return. As an example of that, Derrida finds a minor word in Jean-Jacques Rousseau, because Of Grammatology is a reading in part of the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So he finds a minor word, a neglected corner in Rousseau's text, which is the word supplement, that Rousseau uses quite a lot, but he never uses as a fundamental concept. He almost uses it in passing. But Derrida picks up this word and shows how it secretly organizes the entire logic of the text. It is a marginal element that reshapes the whole. The supplement, which means something added, is shown to already be part of the original, revealing the very structure of Rousseau's thinking. So what's minor is revealed as formative. It is the background detail that destabilizes the entire foreground. So in my own case, because I told you I would retrace a bit my trajectory, in my thesis on Hegel, I tried to use this method in order to reframe the concept of plasticity that, as the word supplement, was just a little thing in Hegel. It's not at all a central concept. It's a neglected corner. It only appears twice in the Hegelian corpus, once in the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit, and once in the lectures on the history of philosophy. So like Derrida, I try to open a reading that is to follow something like a trace in a very thick text, a very forested text, and use it, I try to use it as a car, something moving, creating movement. So that was for the first theory. The second one, transgressing, Foucault and the theory of the limit. This second gesture, and of course the three of them are not separable, they go hand in hand, they are parts of the same economy, I would say. Foucault and the theory of the limit. So this second gesture, transgressing, comes from Foucault, especially his 1984 text called What is Enlightenment? What is Enlightenment is a repetition of Kant's own text called What is Enlightenment? So Foucault intentionally repeats the title, and he responds to Kant and reframes critique as an analysis of limits to question their necessity. As you know, Kant's critical project, the three critiques, critique of pure reason, of practical reason, and of judgment, the critical project was essentially to define boundaries, limits, what we can know and what lies beyond knowing, and why we should not transgress those boundaries. So Foucault agrees with Kant on all points, except precisely the idea of impassable limits. And to artists, this should sound familiar. Art has long engaged in transgressions of medium, genre, identity, property, even legality. But Foucault's challenge is subtle. It's not merely about provocation. Transgressing is about analyzing the conditions of our own subjectivity. In fact, to know what a subject is, we have to transgress the limits of subjectivity. It's complicated, but this is what he explains. So I quote from What is Enlightenment? Criticism, Foucault writes, is no longer to be practiced in the search for formal structures with universal values, but rather as a historical investigation into the events that have led us to constitute ourselves and to recognize ourselves as subjects of what we are doing, thinking, saying. So to be a subject is precisely to establish limits, to say who are we, and in order to answer that question, we have to define who we are, and every act of definition is an act of establishing limits. But as soon as we define those limits, we transgress them, because as soon as we ask, who are we, why do we do that, we are reflecting on this identity and discover that these limits are always our own, and in that sense, they can be transgressed. That is why as soon as we start interrogating ourselves as subject, we immediately go beyond what we know. That's why subjectivity is carried out by ourselves upon ourselves as free beings. So, which means that in fact nobody tells us who we are. This is our own practice. This is our own ontological and political task to define our subjectivity, but once again, when we do so, we immediately transgress these limits. That's why, and I quote Foucault again, he can say, the Kantian question of criticism was that of knowing what limits knowledge has to renounce transgressing. It seems to me that the critical question today has to be turned back into a positive one. How can we invent ourselves? How can we question our ways of being, thinking, the relation to authority, relations between the genders, the way in which we perceive insanity or illness? In fact, to reflect on our subjective constitution is always a transgression to the extent that It consists in reflecting on the norms that we posit and on the way we always transgress them, because they are transformable. Foucault shows us that critique must ask, how are ourselves constructed by the systems we inhabit? And this, of course, echoes dance practices that interrogate discipline itself. I was thinking, for example, of Trisha Brown's gravity-defying scores, for example. It's very clear that how in dance, I mean, the limits are constantly transgressed, as if subjectivity was moving through itself, so to speak, on the stage. That is why what Foucault means when he says critique is, I quote, the art of non-being governed quite so much. To read a system's rule is already to push against that, then. So how can we invent ourselves? This question, again, helps define reading and creating as processes of positing and challenging norms at the same time. Gender, aesthetics, authority, by exposing their constructiveness and their contingency. For me, this theory of limits and transgression as a way to construct subjectivity and transgress at the same time this construction, for me, I used this theory in order to transgress the limits of philosophy itself. And this is when I turned to neuroscience after my work on Hegel. I've been for a long time into continental thinking, but I discovered that the brain was totally excluded from this tradition. And this was the moment when I wrote What Should We Do with Our Brain, a long time ago, which was for me a way to transgress the limits of philosophy and to develop an inquiry into the material and biological notion of subjectivity. Because the neural basis of subjectivity is something that philosophy has, at least continental philosophy, never touched on. Continental philosophers have never been interested in the brain, and this is true for Foucault himself. So when he asks, who are we and how can we invent ourselves, we have to reflect on the limits of authority, gender, etc. He never really explored the domain of the biological basis of subjectivity. And we know that he develops a harsh critique of biology. So I needed to transgress that. So my interest in neurobiology happened when I discovered that the concept of plasticity, first found in Hegel, as I said, had become a central notion in neurobiology, cerebral plasticity, neural plasticity. So this neglected corner in Hegel, plasticity, had become central, but in another discipline. And so that's why, once again, I felt the need of transgressing the limits of philosophy in order to explore this new continent. So this, of course, leads me to approach the third moment, which is the plastic reading proper, shaping and reshaping, plasticity and the theory of form. So just a few elements about neural plasticity, cerebral plasticity. So what we call neural plasticity, what scientists call neural plasticity, characterizes the ability of neural circuits to undergo changes in function or organization due to previous activity. The brain, as we know, can form a great number of new connections. These circuits can grow in size and volume, and also, and on the contrary, be inhibited or depressed by want of activity. So neural plasticity changes the form of the brain. That's why each brain is different. In a book called The Brain That Changes Itself, the neurobiologist Norman Deutsch declares, I quote, "The brain is more than a reflection of our genes." Which means that even if the brain is in part genetically programmed, it it is also totally indeterminate and open to epigenetic transformations. The long life brain development is affected by experience, education, encounters, influences, practices, which explains that it is constantly rewired and reorganized, which means that in fact the brain is shaping itself. So we henceforth cannot think of our relationships with objects, with the other, or with ourselves without interrogating this self-transformable basis of our subjectivity. The brain is the only organ that develops and maintains itself in changing itself, in transforming constantly its own structure and shape. This is why the activity of form, the form of connections, the form of neural networks, becomes a central element in interpreting the relationship between the brain and the world. So all these discoveries, my exploration of the new neurological literature made me realize that maybe we needed to elaborate a theory of plastic reading that would echo the theory of reading as opening, and reading as transgression. Not to challenge them, but to maybe update them and complete them. Because form, the changing of form, as a site of interaction between the inside and the outside, becomes a key element in our approach to the world. And this is something, this work on form, that is not that present in critical theory of the end of the 20th century. We can think, for example, of Deleuze's very sharp and harsh critique of the notion of form. He says, a metamorphosis is never a change of form. He hates this word, form, because for him it evokes something too present, something too consistent. And the vocabulary of form is not that present also in Derrida or Foucault. And I think this is precisely what we have to reintroduce, a new thinking of form, which is also a new way of reading. Plasticity is not present, contrarily to what Deleuze affirms. It is not reconstruction, it is not restoration, it is transformation through also destruction. If we think of a cerebral disease, for example, it is also memory through erasure. Form can be born from the trace of what has lost, of what was lost, sorry. And artists know this, how a work carries the ghost of what it once was or could have been. In painting, installation, dance, performance, form also emerges from deformation. So in my view, a plastic reading reconnects conceptual networks after their deconstruction. It's not about fixing the text or the body, because what has been opened cannot be closed again. It's about animating it again, differently. A plastic reading seeks the form left by absence, the silhouette cast by negation, a line traced in the aftermath of gesture. In the brain, as I said, plasticity is the capacity to form and reform, to strengthen some paths, weaken others, grow or diminish depending on use. This is a material theory of form. It is form shaped by time, encounter, care, but also traumatic repetitions. So I think that we might think today that we need to build new connections between concepts, between disciplines, between histories, and between us. Imagine new solidarities, new alliances, new modes of resistance on the model of neural connections or neural systems, on the mode of these cerebral architectures that we can see through technical imagery. Create new webs, new topologies, new ways to navigate meanings. In performance, as we know, plasticity is visible in the body's memory, how a gesture lingers, how repetition both inscribes and erodes. Plasticity is not flexibility, it is transformation through resistance. And once again, I think that this is what we might try to elaborate, a new way to resist by creating new forms. The plastic reading comes after the deconstructive and transgressive gestures, after Derrida's deconstruction, after Foucault's critique. Once again, it is not naive reconstruction, it opens a future. This is what I've tried to pursue in my later books, reading Freud's psychoanalysis as a theory of form and symptom, interrogating Freud's relationship to neurology, precisely, reading in another book Kant's ethics as a limit that must be broken to be fulfilled. And this is what I've been trying to do in my more recent reflection on philosophical anarchism. Because, and this is something we can discuss, I hope, it seemed to me that anarchism was a type of organization that was as close as possible to what I just described as this kind of neural organization without a center, and this kind of horizontal, systematic system of interactions between different synapses. It is this kind of tension between the neural points that I found so striking in many artistic works today, like for example, the one I saw very recently, the Burn Me exhibition at the Box Gallery, exhibiting the work of Paul McCarthy. As you know, this work shows how forms are reborn from their calcination, from their destruction. They remain the same, yet are totally other to themselves, and create new connections between what has gone, what is lost, and what is appearing now. This is also what I like in Goja's work, all this work on silicon, the way she, in fact, she rebuilds a body out of not parts. I wouldn't call that parts, but I don't know. I would say nodes, moving nodes. But we would have to talk more precisely about that. But for me, what she does is really incarnating plasticity as a mode of reading. Okay, so now I'm coming to a close and hope to discuss with you. I would like to note a deep absence in recent theory, which is the question of consciousness, that derives in fact from the brain. Despite enormous advances in gender, post-colonial studies, Black studies, we rarely see this intersect with neuroscience, as I said, or with the hard question of what it means to be conscious. And I think that if we want to build new connections, including and mostly perhaps political ones, we have perhaps to redefine what consciousness is. So I know that in English you have consciousness and awareness. I in my language, have only one, which is consciousness. So I don't know if I use the right one, but in any case, I'm sure you understand what I mean, like the re-elaboration of awareness or consciousness on these new bases of the neural connections and this new awareness of these new approaches to forms. Frantz Fanon gave us a path for that. In Black Skin, White Masks, he describes how the black subject is produced by both biological fact and cultural fact. A split he calls sociogeny, as we know. Sociogeny is not biology or society alone, but both, and their unity and at the same time the gap between them. And this unity gap, this unity and this gap creates what he calls consciousness after Du Bois and the theory of double consciousness. Sociogeny is a way of thinking human consciousness as the product of both biology and history, of skin and myth. For me, this is another expression of plasticity, the political consciousness as both construction and destruction, as a gesture that holds both. Sylvia Wynter brings this further. Quoting the cognitive philosopher David Chalmers, she identifies what she calls the puzzle of conscious experience. How can matter produce subjectivity? A question that Foucault never asked. She suggests that Fanon opens this question by offering a model of the human as both bios and logos, skin, once again, and mask. Consciousness, she argues, is both an auto-instituting, self-inscribing mode of being and a cognitive mechanism. A hybrid, what she calls a hybrid bios-logos form. I quote, or to say the same with Fanon, humans are always already both bios and mask, mythoi, bios and mythoi in Greek. So I will close on a few questions. What does this mean, all that, for philosophers and artists? Perhaps it means the work of art, like the work of philosophy or theory, can be seen currently as a kind of reading that is at once biological and symbolic, material and conceptual, that is both at the same time a trace, a transgression, and a way of shaping, at the same time a creation, a destruction, and the formation of a new consciousness. So let me leave you with these questions. What is the form left by a trace? What shape does a transgression take? What shape does a transgression take? And how to reopen or keep open the traces of consciousness. Thank you.
Would you take some questions, if there are some questions?
Thank you so much.
If there are any questions, you may just stand up and speak loud because we only have one mic.
No, but I think I can hear.
Catherine, I'll just say something.
Of course.
So I was very struck by your description of how in the late 20th century.
Can you hear?
No.
Maybe not. Maybe not.
No, I'll use my teacherly voice. I was very struck by this discussion of the lack of attention to form philosophically in the late 20th century. But I was also, But that, of course, makes me think about the discourse around formlessness that was at the end of the 20th century, namely L'Enfant, the show at the Beaubourg, organized by Yves Bois and Rosalind Krauss. And I think that, one of the things that was perhaps misunderstood about that exhibition and that project was that it was not so much a tribute to Bataille or to illustrate that idea, but instead, and this is what I found very sympathetic with your proposal, is that it's almost as if the way that Rosalind and Evelyn described it was that it was that the formless has a job to do, and that job to do was to undo the good form of modernism, of enlightenment, etc., right? So it makes me think about how, in some ways, one does not necessarily even need to look at the visuality of form or the recognizability of form, in the sense that, for example, I've always thought that one way of thinking about the trace is through the word score. The word score in, let's say, Trisha Brown's score, right? But also a musical score, that in English, the word score means literally also to cut, you know. So I'm just being teacherly. And I wanted to just start us off by saying that, you know, there is this whole other body of thinking, you know, around the formless, you know, from the later part of the 20th century. But also, you know, I'm so glad that you mentioned Paul's project, which he began last year, you know, because, you know, I remember seeing him in January, and he says, I'm going to London to, you know, because I'm doing this stuff with AI. And of course the fire happened. And Burn Me was an exhibition, you know, in a sense to discuss the conversions of political, natural, and ecological crises. So, I mean, I feel that maybe that's another example of the kind of solidarity that can be charted through something that was already, you know, he was already making it, you know, as a way to think about the technological, aesthetic, political nexus, you know, that AI has become. So I just wanted to start us off by pointing out these different examples.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much, Simon. It's really accurate and interesting. So I've been, of course, reflecting a lot on the formless and this exhibition in particular. So this was in Beaubourg. When was that? In the 80s?
97.
97. Oh yeah, so later than I remember. And it was about, this exhibition was about heaps, dust, garbage, scraps. You could see everywhere these objects, I don't know if we call them, you can call them objects, traces, we could call them, and the aim of the exhibition was to affirm that the notion of form in its classical understanding, which is the shape, the contour, presence, is not adequate anymore to describe the traumatic experiences of the 20th century. And as Simon just recalled, it was an allusion to Bataille and the way in which Bataille, precisely because of his theory of transgression, is dissolving the classical notion of form. Of course, this was important. This was an important intervention, but I then started to think, because this was the moment when I was also working on plasticity, so I felt very challenged by this exhibition. But it appeared to me, as you said in a way, that even a heap is a form. Even a pile is a form. Even dust has a form. It depends, of course, of what we mean by form. And you're right to say that it cannot be the good form anymore, like maybe the Greek sculpture or, I don't know, representations in general, figurative painting. But at the same time, a form, and this I learned from Hegel, is not necessarily, and I should have said that, but I didn't have time really to develop. A form is not necessarily visible, as you said. It is what Hegel calls before his time, in anticipation, so to speak, an installation into something. It is the emergence of an event in a space. And this is not necessarily visual, once again, but it is what organizes a space around it. So it can be something that is formless, but nevertheless, it is a form. So That's,
But I would also say that for Bois and Krauss, that was exactly what they were against. They were against the thinking of the heap of thing on the ground as the reading of the Thai by way of history. In a sense, I think it's very much, in a way, sympathetic to this idea of transgression produces the
yeah,
limit.
but you're right. But many artists and many thinkers at the time understood it in that, in the other way. And I remember that the critiques I got regarding plasticity is that plasticity was too reassuring a concept, too sheltering, too round, too close to the beautiful form. So maybe it was a misunderstanding of Bois' work, but this is how it had been understood. It has been understood at some point.
Thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to just call in for a minute place-based reality, and that we're sitting on right now in a gallery in a warehouse on the edge of what would have been an unbridled and wild river. So the trains that you just heard going by suggest a form, a straitjacket, given to a wild, raging river, and colonizing that watershed so that it could not ruin properties, and placing conduits for global trade along the edges of that, which are the Alameda corridor. And so the fires that you're referring to when you're talking about Burn Me call on man-made things that got burned without really talking about the colonial restriction of rivers and forests of where we live and how to really tackle environmental regeneration. We have to think outside of the box of continental thinking that we've imported into this particular location to question this idea of rupture and formlessness, and think about what kinship with wild rivers would mean in terms of the possibility of being able to breathe here again. Because underneath that concrete jacket is the primordial floodplain still waiting to be resurrected. But when you do resurrect it, it appears to be formless. It appears to be like gravel. But embedded in that is what Vandana Shiva would call the truly radical thing, which is the seed. The seed which has the capacity to return and regenerate life as we know it. So I'm wondering how my long comment here might be interpreted in terms of one of your questions. Like if we go to your questions philosophically,
Yes.
how would you speak for things that can't speak for themselves? Like the living material that depends, like every metabolic thing, on dying for regeneration. And when you prevent that cycle from being, how philosophically can you talk about that?
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, thank you for letting me know about this place. I didn't know, I didn't even know that it was trains that we were hearing. So thank you. No, it's very, very interesting. And I hear you. I mean, it's true that these continental discourses are extremely formating, and that they certainly obfuscate, I don't know how to say that, or inhibit a lot of voices, but at the same time voiceless instances. So at the same time, this is not, I don't want to defend my theory at all costs, you know, but this also I didn't have time to really develop. For me, in plasticity, I hear plastic in the sense of the explosive. And what interests me in plasticity is the coincidence of creation and destruction. For example, working on the brain, I discovered how this art, neural architecture I talked about was so fragile that a little accident can destroy your identity, and that we're always walking on a very, very precarious ground, whatever we do. And so this is not that I'm trying to advocate for form by becoming blind to seeds or destroyed or wounded parts of the world, but it is, I think, on the contrary, a way to organize a space for them to appear. Because it's not enough to say, okay, the river has been derived, or you also have to find a way to make it significant, because it's so easy to negate that. As we know, so many people are denying climate change today. It's so easy to say, no, it doesn't exist. So we have to find a way to speak for these wounded parts of nature or of the earth. And this is what form for me means, like organizing a colloquium, a structure through which we can address the question of destruction. It's not enough, certainly, but this is how I see it. So, you, and then there's a question in the back.
Thank you again for your talk, and I like your history of 20th, 21st century reading practices. One of the things that occurred to me when I was listening to you speak is, for the last 500 years, maybe 400 years in the Western world, we've had this habit of taking some way of spatio-temporal organisation that has been developed in science and then imposing it on everything. So the first one was clockwork. Then there was clockwork.
Okay.
You understand the word?
Yes.
Then there was organicism. Everything was. Then there was information, data technology. That metaphor is still around. And now we're moving to the neuroscientific conception of the brain. But every single time, these models come from the very elite top end of science, which are 99.9999999% done by very elite, educationally trained, predominantly, if not white, often very white people in their own society. And so it bothers me that we keep repeating this gesture, that why do we take these overarching metaphors of what are actually very narrow sciences, even brain science, okay? It might be more than clockwork, it might be more than billiard balls spinning around on the table. But it's not a conception of life as a whole that includes kinship systems, the weather, the totality of the cosmos. It's just, and then we impose that on everything. And you can do that ad infinitum. I mean, I could probably choose texts from food literaires across history who've taken some model and then imposed it on everything, and they're considered insane. Why is what we're doing philosophically any different? You just take any metaphor and see the universe through it.
Well, okay, thank you. First, I wouldn't say that plasticity or opening or transgression are metaphors. They really are gestures, and they are literal. Plasticity has to be understood literally. But this is not what I would like to say to you. Okay, it's true that I'm speaking from a certain tradition. I'm speaking from my background, and it's true that my discourse is one, yes, from the elite, you're right. But then I will return the question to you. You're also part of the elite, and I wonder what these new interests in kinship and non-Western modes of transmission, etc. What do they become when they are appropriated by the elite? I could return the same thing, you know? when non-indigenous people are using indigenous culture to challenge, let's say, Western thinking. It's a circle, it's the snake that bites its own tail. You see what I mean?
No, I totally agree with you. I don't think that we in the West should appropriate there. I was just saying that, yeah, that these models are constantly from very narrow sciences by very super educated people, and they don't, they.
I mean, I'm sorry, but this is dangerous because I hear some of Trump's critiques of science. Like, science is for the elite. It's done by a very little number of people, and this is, this is imposed on us by violence. So, what is this critique of science?
I live with the science writer. I'm not criticising science. I'm criticising science as a model for everything else, for society.
Yes, that was a question.
Yes, thank you so much, Natalie, for your talk. I think I have a very zoomed-in kind of local question for you. So when you articulated that you were going to be thinking about opening, transgressing, informing, you framed these in terms of gestures of reading, broadly speaking. So, and then thinking about reading, I'm a literature professor, and I wonder if you could say a little bit about the relationship between plasticity as a gesture of reading and the kind of retroaction of meaning that literary criticism and literary theory has discovered over the course of, let's say, the last 2 centuries, whereby a new text retroactively constructs a different iteration of the text from which it derives. I'm thinking, I'm thinking like something as canonical as like T.S. Eliot's tradition of individual talent, where an older text becomes something new from the perspective of the most recent work of literature to draw on it. So that retroaction of meaning that we're familiar with in the field of literary history, literary theory, plasticity, I'm assuming there's some critical difference in the way that you're thinking about plasticity as reading from that retroactivity. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between the two.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I will not be able to answer from the point of view of literature because this is not my field, but this is exactly how it works in philosophy for me. I mean, all these texts belonging to the classical canon, like Hegel, Kant, and whoever, including Heidegger, having been so deconstructed, criticized, rejected, etc., re-emerging in a new form, precisely as if they were reborn from their ashes, thanks to new modes of reading. For example, to give you an example, the other day in my class we read this book by the black nihilist philosopher Calvin Warren called Ontological Terror, in which he uses Heidegger in order to analyze, I don't know how to say that, to interpret what black being is, and he writes being under cross, under erasure, and this is a method borrowed from Heidegger. This is an example of how a text like Being in Time, for example, can, yes, become something totally different, re-elaborated, without changing form, in a certain sense. So it's a kind of inner transformation. Yes, absolutely. Thank you. But to go back to plasticity and the elite and all that, plasticity is also used in ecology. For example, it's the synonym for resilience when it comes to Amazonia, the forest. It is a term that is used in many domains that are not necessarily scientific and designate this double movement of destruction formation. So, yeah. Yes.
Just a note of appreciation, but maybe also to bounce off the question 2 ago. You know, it's refreshing to hear, you know, your angle of plasticity. I mean, because in America especially, the kind of, you know, the philosophical, let's call it, you know, analytic American philosophy is all about, you know, consciousness and then the so-called consciousness study, but it is tied up with a kind of, you know, inherent kind of logical positivistic paragraph sentence structure, and you know, I think she provides us a little nook or a little way of a peek at looking at these topics from you know, this sort of, to get away from a kind of normativity and dominance you were talking about. Just a gesture of appreciation of hearing your, you know, this different way of looking at this area of consciousness of that of the brain from a standpoint that we don't hear as much in America.
Yes, thank you, of course, and for many, let's say, American philosophers, in the analytic tradition, this approach to the brain is just metaphysics. You know, precisely, it's not science. You know, and this is the usual critique that we continental philosophers receive from Anglo-Saxon philosophers. So that's why I was looking on purpose for ways of mixing, bringing together neurobiology and continental philosophy and cognitive science, and I found it in Sylvia Winter. But you're right, it's not frequent, I know that.
Can you talk a little bit more about how you use scientific inquiry in your exploration of consciousness? Just because it seems from, I mean, I haven't read, I really appreciate your talk, I haven't read much of your work, I look forward to, but seems to me that just scientific inquiry seems to hit a limit at the sort of idea of consciousness, and so I'm curious how you bridge that.
So, contemporary theories of consciousness, and it's really come from the American tradition, maybe. So, current theories of consciousness are about emergence. I don't know if you know this concept. So, it is about how from, I hope I can explain that, from material, blind, neural processes that are that exist in all living beings, how something like consciousness can emerge, like how all of a sudden, almost in the evolution, on the evolution line, some beings, human beings, by the way, have a different brain because at some point on the evolutionary line, something emerged from these layers, and it is not possible to explain that. It is a surplus of brain activity. It's the birth of the cerebral cortex that is not explicable. And the only way to describe it is a theory of plasticity. That is how, at some point, you have like material, and all of a sudden, it creates a form. So the emergence, as a theory of consciousness, is a theory of plasticity. Because in fact, nobody can explain exactly what consciousness, where it comes from.
Well then, so does the scientific inquiry, does it hit a limit then? I mean, it seems like you're...
No, not at all. It doesn't limit it, on the contrary. No,
What?
Because they try to refine, and of course the goal is to wonder if artificial intelligence can bring the answer back. Now this is all about, I mean, as you know, I mean, AI systems are all about that. Like, would it be possible to understand the emergence of consciousness through artificial systems? Because one day, we might have something like a conscious machine. So it's not a limit, it's a kind of...
Just to explain, I mean, you said we don't have an explanation for the emergence, and it seems that science can't actually provide an explanation for the emergence. It can only give a sort of shape for it.
Well, let's say that they can build models for the emergence. Like, the vocabulary is so plasticity, but also firing, neurons that wire together, fire together, you know, this kind of, so it's true that these are metaphors, but it is supposed to explain how, yeah, something like electric, yeah.
So we're talking about subjective consciousness that emerges from neural and biological processes. Certain schools or traditions in Eastern philosophy refers to consciousness that does not simply arise from the brain, and it's also formless. So we also reference formlessness. So I was wondering if you...
What do you mean by formlessness? In that
as in not clear defined boundaries, borders, and so on. So they refer to this consciousness as not being emergent and as being formless. So I was wondering if you could address that non-emergent consciousness.
No, because I'm not familiar with these Asian traditions. The only thing I can tell you is that the Dalai Lama is a very studied subject, you know, for neurologists. Most of them go to retreat with him, developing forms, states of consciousness, reached through meditations, different states of consciousness coming from Buddhism. So Buddhism also provides a kind of laboratory for neuroscientific research, but I can't tell you much more because I don't know what you mean by formlessness in that case. In phenomenology today, cognitive phenomenology, it seems to me that the use of Buddhism is very much using the vocabulary of form, but I can't say much more. Yes, Boris.
I think to kind of connect what you're saying, Christine, to what Catherine's work, is the use of the neuroscience and the ontology of the accident, and how that study of it is a deconstruction in a way of a Western hegemony. That's exactly what the work is about, is deconstructing that hegemony. And what it led to, the next steps were about anarchy, which I think is really interesting, because the next step of plasticity and kind of questions of power, really, because that's what it's about. It leads to the study of a political question on anarchy. And that is a more Western, it's a Western response to a Western problem, which I think is what interests me deeply. Could you talk about that?
Yes, thank you so much. It's exactly, I mean, you said exactly what needed to be said. Exactly, this is a Western way of challenging the West. I can't be someone that I'm not. I can't speak from a tradition that is not mine. And this means I was suspicious of all these new appropriations of indigenous cultures coming from non-indigenous people. And I understand my black students when they say, well, you're not black, you can't speak for us. So we all come from somewhere, and it would be impossible for me to say, no, I'm just rejecting the Western canon, because this would still be a Western gesture. And so Corazon is totally right to say that it is a project, a Western project that at the same time challenges the Western tradition, because my political stance in all that is true anarchism, which is the destruction of all power position, of all of the concept of domination that I've explored so much in the book, like the decapitation, I don't know, beheading of all notion of government. So in that sense, I think that through this Western tradition, and anarchism belongs to it. You know, anarchism in the beginning is Western. Proudhon, all these people. It's a way of burning, so to speak, the Western tradition itself. Because anarchism remains extremely dangerous.
I was wondering, I mean, I haven't fully formed a question, Kristen just said something, but I told you earlier I agree with Garno, and so, and I was reading and rereading this essay called Education After Auschwitz, and it's like, how that all education after Auschwitz should be about preventing genocide again,
Yes.
this kind of thing, and it came up for me when you were talking at the last part about shaping consciousness, because one of the things he writes about is like the way we repress the darkest aspects of our humanity, especially in education and childhood. We don't talk, we like repress those things, and that if we kind of were conscious of them all the time, if every morning I woke up and said, I have the capacity to become a monster, then I probably wouldn't, or something. Like there would be a consciousness around that. I don't know, I guess I was thinking like, how do we shape consciousness? Like, is it through education? Is it through substance? Is it through like brain, like some sort of augmentation? Like, is it material? I mean, this is like a
I know.
broader,
This is
like
an
urgent feeling.
impossible question.
Yeah.
An impossible question when you see how easy it is to deny the obvious.
Exactly.
And this is precisely where we are. Consciousness seems to be totally numb or absent, or and blinding oneself to reality is such a powerful gesture.
Yeah.
So how do we do that? Perhaps I can only tell you what I'm trying to do very modestly, because who can answer to this question? I'm also interested in anarchism, because these people who deny reality, are the tech giants and the conservative politicians today claim themselves anarchists, libertarians.
Yeah.
You know that Millet with the chainsaw, like we're cutting through government, etc. So, unfortunately, anarchism is also a right-wing, very conservative position, and I'm interested precisely in looking at what my consciousness and their consciousness have in common, which is precisely this critique of the notion of government. And I'm very interested in libertarianism and freedom, this notion of freedom, and through the concept of freedom that is common to the two anarchism, right wing and left wing. And this notion of freedom has so opposed meanings that my work consists in trying to find the middle points between the two opposed concepts of freedom or anarchism, in order to try to make this opposition conscious, in order to produce it, in order to try to demonstrate how we can use the same materials, we can use the same concepts, we can use the same space and say two opposed things. Okay? For example, I was I fell upon this sentence by Sartre talking about freedom. Like, freedom is the groundlessness of all grounds. Such a sentence could be used by one of the tech, when they say freedom of speech, when they defend Twitter or X, like everybody can speak because there's no ground. So it's very interesting to try to bring to light something like the consciousness of the fact that consciousness is always split. And that once again the same concept, the same person almost can be divided into and manifest to opposed. It's a different position than that of, okay, you think this, I think that, and we fight. No. I think the position is to say, we are the same. Precisely, we are walking on the same ground, and this is the difficulty. So I try to draw a line where there's no line. Well, that's a way, maybe.
I just want to ask, but does that not actually, part of the difference is that I see such a vast difference between the will to domination, from the right and the left, right? So it seems in some ways that the question of freedom as claimed by the right is also at the same time a consolidation of identity and subjectivity, but always there is a will to dominate others, right? So I just want to, in a sense, say that anarchism, of course there's left and right anarchism, but it seems to me that a certain modality of anarchism hinges on resentment and domination.
And all these people like Millet, etc., and the others are tyrants. But what is interesting is that their enemy is not that much communism, it's anarchism. They use anarchism against itself by saying we're more liberal than the others. Their discourse is not a discourse of domination. Of course they are tyrants. But their discourse is more like a discourse of freedom, of the tyrants are the tyrant is the government. This is the domination. I've read terrible things about Greta Thunberg. One tech giant said she is the real dictator because she wants to regulate our okay. So this also, domination is a very ambiguous concept because you can launch the ball like that. You are the one who dominates. No, you. It's very difficult.
But it comes to us through a structure of disavowal. You know what I'm saying? That
okay, but tell them you're disavowing. I mean, when you speak like that of Greta Thunberg, you are disavowing. I mean, but I have no answer. We really have to walk on the ground with no where differences have to be precisely to take shape. We're not in a clear, of course we know what we don't want, but at the level of discourses, the vocabulary, the values are very close, are seemingly close, and that we have to make new forms of difference emerge, precisely since the fear of emergence. Because in fact, both have this discourse, both sides of anarchism have this discourse on horizontality. We don't want verticality anymore. We want horizontality. Everybody is free. The Uberization of life.
Right.
Everything is horizontal. And you can rent your apartment, you can rent an Uber, you are your own manager. Who wants the vertical? it's one horizontality against another.
Well, horizontality is also a form. Right? Horizontality, you know, is just as form-based, you know, as verticality.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm saying is that so yes, you can't really say to whoever these people are and say you're disavowing.
Mm.
But I think that disavow works exactly through because it works exactly through this choreography of simultaneously assertion and self-deception. I'm just wondering if what you mean by solidarity, because it seems to me that the Trump supporters are obviously not just the billionaires, right? There's also a great, a lot of people who avail themselves of that disavowal, especially around race, right? And it seems to me that in some ways, what you're asking for in terms of this plasticity in imagining otherwise would be something, because I don't think we can actually go even towards rationality, right? Would be some kind of solidarity through an identification with affective identifications, right? I mean, the thing that I'm thinking about is failure, for example, that people in fact identify with failure, as a type of embodied violence that visits upon different people. And I'm just thinking about that there are different ways in which we identify with failure. You can be an entrepreneur, in the American sense of the word. And you could fail because you've sunk all of your money into this one thing, right? But you still identify with the entrepreneurial spirit, this Protestant spirit, so to speak. But we allow Elon Musk or whoever, the tech billionaires are to fail over and over and over again.
What do you mean we allow?
What I'm saying is that there is a fetishism of technological innovation and the entrepreneurial, so that they are allowed to fail, 100 times, and then finally get to the iPhone or finally get to the Tesla, and we fetishize that, right? So,
I don't think we fetishize that. The problem is that here also, it will be a long discussion. We are users of the internet. The internet was, in the beginning, as you know, an anarchist project. It was connecting people like neural connections, connecting people horizontally. And so we're using precisely these platforms that these people are creating. So it's not that we fetishize them, it's because, and that's why differences are so difficult to make. We're walking on the same ground. Okay, we critique technology, but we use them. We are into it. It's not that we fetishize it, it's because we are into horizontality. And there's no way we can get out of it. So we have to make differences emerge from this same ground altogether. I'm repeating myself.
But, okay, so instead of fetishization, I'm just thinking about some things like believing in freedom, valorizing freedom, of how that, at least in the American context, is tied to a certain entrepreneurial or self-made ideology of individualism, right? So what I'm basically asking, I'm not saying horizontality is good or bad or anything like that, right? Like you said, it simply exists, right? But in terms of the possibility of solidarity, okay, this is what I'm really asking. In terms of the possibility of solidarity, I wonder if what you're talking about in terms of plasticity is not so much based on the possibility of realigning consciousness, but realigning feelings, right? Realigning forms of identification with same change, same track. I don't know.
No, I don't know either. But thank you. Yeah, I would think so. But yes, of course, affects are important. Yeah. Are there other questions or should we? Okay. It depends on that.
I think we will have more questions. Anybody else? You can also.
Marianne,
Yeah.
and Christine.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
I don't know if it's
Speak.
okay. So I was just thinking. Probably recently I've been reading a bit of RNs and like RNs and
Okay.
RNs
Yes.
and when she's talking about like human condition, like she's talking about like mentality of human condition or like human care, something like this. So I'm really reaching out here from a different point. So I just, it's a question like how are we thinking about, for example, praxis in relation to plasticity? Like, is it a way to more think about praxis rather than something like essence? Like, for me, it sounds something that actually grounds subject in a different way, maybe through praxis rather than some sort of essence. I mean, of course, it's trying to look at, it looks at brain because maybe it traces praxis in a way in brain too. But I'm just saying, I just wanted to know how you're, how you think about it.
But you know, I think that the greatest theories of praxis, if I may say so, are always they all depart from biology and materiality. The greatest one is of course Marxist, and Marx grounds his notion of praxis in the body, in the exploration of the body, in the exploration of the labor force. So of course, when I speak of brain plasticity, for me it's the raw material of praxis. Because this is what, at the same time, can inform the world, but also be exploited, be also influenced, be also destroyed. So yes, of course. I mean, praxis. I mean, the great concepts of praxis are always materialist, always.
Hi. My question is going back to what is enlightenment. You discussed Foucault's also like overview of Kant, and I wonder if you can speak more of when he also moves through Baudelaire and heroism of modernity, and in a way of trying to create an ethics that is a system within the self that catches the fleeting, but at the same time it's supposed to also be eternal. And in a way creating maybe a fashioning of the self, like the dandyism. And I'm wondering if you would agree or not that maybe plasticity would still be this trying to gesture also to a heroic kind of life of posturing, or is heroism in a sense of trying to make the modern a heroic kind of way of living still sustainable or present?
So yeah, it is true that in What is Enlightenment, Foucault talks about Baudelaire. This because Baudelaire has a text on modernity, and he shapes, let's say, the figure of the modern man, who is the 19th century man, wearing the, hats, dressed in black, etc. And Foucault says Baudelaire is inventing the shape of the present. He's fashioning the modern subjectivity. This because he wants to show that Kant's critique is not atemporal, is not timeless, but it is always also inscribed in modernity, and that Baudelaire's gesture and Kant's gesture are not so different. So we can only speak from where we are at a time when we are right now. So Baudelaire was in the 19th century, Kant the 18th, okay, and now we are in our time. So each time, it's a matter of plasticity to the extent that being of our time means to try to figure out what the subject is in our time. So I know there are several subjects, of course, but maybe we could isolate something like a structure. In that sense, I understand your question, that it may be a fashioning of the hero of the 21st century. Like the structure of subjectivity, the current structure of subjectivity as a kind of universal form, just as Baudelaire was describing who the 19th century man was. So okay, that might be that, like unifying the modern subjectivity under one type, okay, just like Baudelaire tried to depict the modern man in his time. I wonder, and this is a very important question. Is it possible, and this also refers to many things that have been asked, is it possible to do without a form? That is it possible to do without a structure? Even if we think of differences, diversity, etc., etc. Is it possible to create? It's not only to think, philosophically of course, but also to create, to build, to imagine, to be politically active, to create new solidarities. Is it possible to do that without building a kind of structure? And this is what I call plasticity, because the structure is not rigid, it is malleable, it is supple. And I don't think that necessarily the fashioning of a structure, like what is the structure of modern subjectivity, is necessarily the cult of the hero. But yes, my question is also for you. Is it really possible to and this takes us back to the notion of the informed, to see things as very different, inassimilable, heterogeneous to one another, like dust or scraps. Is it possible to see that without immediately imposing something like a structure? So that's my question. For me, it is not. So. Thank you.